Hey, welcome to ART101, our video version of our Wednesday replacement class. Thank you guys for your emails about my health. I had an operation on my knee, and actually it's doing pretty good. So thank you for your inquiries about my health. I am decently healthy. This is a replacement for the class that didn't happen on Wednesday. Thank you guys for your patience around that. So let's do the thing. So hopefully you can see me in a little window down here. We'll go straight to the lecture. Okay, great. Let's see. Is audio recording? Yes, it seems to be. You're hearing me, you're seeing me, you're seeing the code challenge. Let's talk about that. So the thing that I wanted to do on Monday, but ran out of time, and the thing I wanted to do on Wednesday, but wasn't there. Let's explore using an API. So we're going to go to JS Fiddle, and we're going to code an AJAX call to fetch output from a random yes or no API. It's a pretty simple API. The one I was trying to use in class on Monday was the, what was that? Oh, the numbers API. Now the problem with numbers API is that it only is available via HTTP. If you remember a long time ago, I told you that you should file as a problem you'll have in the future that you can't mix HTTP, insecure web stuff, with HTTPS, which is secure web stuff. So when we were trying to go to JS Fiddle using HTTPS, and we were trying to go to the HTTP numbers API, the insecure numbers API, it didn't work, and we got complaints from our browser. So instead, we're going to use the yes/no API, though it is slightly less clear because the result is returned in JSON. But we will talk about that today, and you will be much the wiser for it. Okay, so let's use the numbers API. The first thing you want to do so APIs are really challenging because every single one is a little bit different, and you have to go to the documentation. We can actually do that. We can just go to the yes/no API. You can see this is the endpoint. Here's what it looks like if you just go to the website. And then there's a little instructions. This one's a little bit more cryptic, but it tells you how to hit the API. So this website returns an image and tells you yes or no. For some reason, my browser always wants to translate it. No. So you can ask a question. Do you think you'll understand everything in this lecture? Let's find out. Reload. Yes, of course you will. So let's start off by going to JS Fiddle. Here's JS Fiddle. Here's what the instructions, my code challenge told you. Code a jQuery API call to fetch output from a random yes/no. Okay, right. So the first thing we'll do is we'll go to the API endpoint just because we want to make sure it works. So here, minus the fancy front page of the API website, we can just get results. So the answer is yes, and there's an image associated with it. The answer is yes, another image. So one answer is no. So it gives you a random answer. Great, very useful. Kind of a silly API, but very useful for us for learning this. So first thing we're going to do, we're just going to code a place for the output to go. Little div ID equals output. And kabam, there's our div, not very fancy. And then we'll just see if that works. Okay, there's a div, but there's nothing in it. We could give it a border if we wanted to. We're not going to. Now we're going to use something that jQuery makes much easier. Is we can select our div, right? And how do we select that? jQuery, right? So $, parenthesis, quote. This is going to be the selector. As you know, we're going to select the ID. So we say output. Okay, all good so far. We could do whatever we wanted with it, but what we're going to do is we're going to use jQuery's ability to do API calls, very fancy, easy style. So we say load, and then we're just going to give the API endpoint. In this case, we're not going to do like the whole callback business. We're just going to do the simplest thing possible. So we put in the API endpoint. If we can find it, here it is. Stick that into the load. Now, if we wanted it to have an anonymous function call, that it would do a thing if it successfully loads, or do a thing or if it fails. It's possible, but in this case, we're going to hope that it works, and we're just going to run it and see what happens. So what load does, it's a jQuery method that will take the output of this API, and it's going to put it right into our output. Bam. And it worked, though one wouldn't know it just because it's kind of cryptic, right? So look at that carefully. That should look kind of familiar, because that is looks a little bit like a JavaScript object. And in fact, it is a JavaScript. Well, it's a text that represents a JavaScript object. So we have key, value, key, value, key, value, and so on, right? And then lastly, there's even one key that is an image, and one that's an output. So all right, so get used to the look of this key value pair business. That is actually a thing I'm going to introduce today called JSON. Let's see if it works. We run it a couple more times, and you can see the answer is no, the answer is yes, the answer is no, the answer is yes. And it is going to a website. I mean, obviously JS Fiddle is a website, but JS Fiddle itself is going to the yes/no API and grabbing some data, which is cool. Now imagine, there's tons of like frivolous, goofy APIs. There's kitten APIs. There's a Chuck Norris quote API. There is a dad joke API, and for the most part, they all kind of return stuff in JSON. So, and some are more sophisticated than others. This is all JSON coming back from the iCanHasDadJoke.com API. But let's look to see what it's returning. So howdy, welcome to Introduction to Programming for the Arts. I am your now online host, Westmode. Here's what I want to do. I want to introduce you to JSON. I want to convince you that it won't be as challenging or as intimidating as you think it will be. I want to introduce you to various APIs, and then I want to give you a few rules that will help you understand the APIs that you guys are thinking of tackling for your final project. So the first thing is JSON. I want you to set aside your terror at learning a new thing. This is actually an old thing, but it comes to you in a slightly different package. So there's something called JSON, and JSON, and it stands for JavaScript Object Notation. So it actually is the way that most websites these days transfer information between themselves. So that's cool, because we're using JavaScript, and there are lots of facilities built into the language that make it pretty easy and possible. So JSON's used to transport data between servers and applications, used to store data. It's key value pairs, just like you're familiar with from regular JSON objects. And an alternative is XML, something that is terrifyingly complicated looking. JSON is a much better solution, and the entire web thinks so. That's why everybody uses it. It's more or less human readable. You can build super dynamic interactive websites. It can be used to communicate between servers. And so on, right? So let's look at an example. Here's an example. This is some weird record of not so weird a fruit, a watermelon. Um, and what do you see here? You see something that looks kind of familiar. Here's your mustaches from when we created objects. And then here's a key and a value, a key and a value. This is super similar to like before when we were like make, Schwinn, model, Latour, color, gold, etc. If you remember that. So let's just look at some of the ways in which JSON can be structured. I'm not going to go over too much what these mean. You can have unordered collection of name value pairs, that is to say, just key and a value, which would be here, key, value, key, oops, sorry, key, value, key, value, key, value, etc. You can have an ordered collection of values, like an array, which we have here. So US, California, Mexico. You can also have Boolean, strings, objects, or an array. So those are familiar again. So here's JSON compared to XML. As you can see, it's still readable, sort of, but a little more prone to error. So it's really easy to like mess up XML, where JSON is pretty easy to recognize, particularly if you're used to JavaScript, which it actually is legitimate JavaScript. So sweet. So we can use the JSON method to convert objects to JSON strings. So that's really useful. So we can basically convert. So if you think about it like a JSON object is only something that is useful within JavaScript. The rest of the web doesn't really speak JavaScript objects. What it transfers back and forth are strings. Now those strings can be whatever, HTML or CSS or JavaScript itself. They come across the web as strings, and so we're going to have to, when we get them as strings, we're going to have to convert them to JSON objects. Or if we have JSON objects, we're going to have to convert them to strings to go back and forth. So if we have an object that's called melon that has some key value pairs in it, we can use JSON stringify to turn it into a string. So here's the result. I've defined a var melon, which is a JSON object with key value pairs, just like you're familiar with. And then we can use JSON stringify, and it turns it into one nice little string with the quotes and all the stuff like taken care of. So that's one giant string, the part that's in red under JSON stringify. Think of that as like getting ready to send it across the web as a, like from an API or something. We can also do the opposite. So if we, and this is for us way more common, we'll get a JSON string from an API, and then we'll use JSON parse to turn it into a JSON object, which is useful because then we can like look specifically at elements within it. So here's an example. Here's our JSON string. It's if you remember, we created that up here. It's going to be melon. We stringified the JSON string up at the first line, and then the second time we parse that JSON string just to like turn it back into an object, and then you can see it's an object with all of its standard, methods and attributes and so on, including like length and so on. So yay. So because they're just regular JavaScript objects, we can access them the exact same way. So we can say, looking back at the way that it's constructed, we have a couple key value pairs, ID, watermelon, available, true, and so on. We can access those things just like you did when you were messing around with JSON objects. You were hoping those wouldn't come back, but they definitely are coming back, and they're definitely important. So here, we can say melon.id, and it returns watermelon. We can say melon.available, it says true, and so on, right? Even down to like returning an array, we can say melon.countries, and we get an array back, and we can We're even clever enough JavaScript people to where we can access the individual elements US, CA, MX. Now, remember that there are two ways you can access the values in those key value pairs. We can say melon.countries, or we can say melon square bracket, quote, countries, unquote, close square bracket, and it will also return the same thing. So the reason we're talking about JSON right now is because APIs almost always return JSON. And so we've played with the random number generator. Let's try this one. This is, it displays actually a random number. Oh God, what's gonna happen? It looks like it's going straight to an endpoint. Let's see what it returns. How's my internet? Looks good. A little slow. Maybe it's been still work. I don't know. Okay, we'll go back to that in a minute. Maybe. Yeah. Yeah. No, buddy. Let's just make sure that website's still alive. Nope. Yep, it is. Okay, so there we go. So when we hit reload, we get a different number. The question here was, what's the data type the number, string, array, or object is returned for the key data? So let's look at this data key. So the data is in a key called data, and then it returns a number. What kind of data type is that? That's an int or a number. Then we can use that. Let's hit reload on the endpoint again, see what we get. Seems like it is possibly the slowest API on the internet at the moment. Dun, 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 dun. Here it is, 25. Okay, so we can get a random number API from this. Whoops. And then what's the random number returned? It is that 25. So if you went to that API, what would you do with all that? It's a bunch of text, right? And then you need to convert that text into a JSON object, and then you would look at the data, and you notice that actually data is not an int, but it's an array. Sorry about that. The reason is that you can also ask, this says linked 1, but we can ask for, what if we want 5 random numbers? That's also possible. So it's going to return an array of random numbers. There they are. So if you wanted to get your random number, you'd have to turn this string into a JSON object, then go to data, and then you'd have to look at the first element of that array if you wanted to use it for, I don't know, whatever you're doing. Okay. So APIs return JSON. You remember our numbers API. Let's give it a try again. Now you see, while we can't use this with JS Fiddle because it's not secure, it's HTTP, not HTTPS, but it is illuminating that it returns JSON, right? So text 42 is the third pentadecagonal number. You knew that, of course, duh. And there it is, number 42. We can also get a random number, but I forget how to do that from the numbers API. Maybe it has more data about it. Oh yeah, look, 42 is the process of the first three, is the product of the first 3 terms of Sylvester's sequence. Like the first 5 such numbers, it is also a primary pseudo-perfect number. You knew that too, of course. Okay, so again, if we were trying to retrieve the text, we'd have to take this giant bit of text, right, which is going to come to us as a string. We'd have to convert it to a JSON object, and then we would walk through it and get the text. So if we assigned it to whatever, output or JSON output, we'd say JSON output.text. Or if we wanted to get the number itself, we'd say JSON output.number or JSON output square bracket number, right? Okay, so that is JSON. Hopefully that is not super intimidating because it is what you're going to be using a lot when you deal with um, APIs. And I'll give you, we'll look at some recipes for how we can convert the results or the output of an API and convert them into something that's very usable. API is information at the world at your fingertips. So we've been talking about APIs, but what does that mean? What does it stand for? It's an application programmer interface. Um, so it is one of the most general terms. The software on your machine, when you're running Chrome, it uses an API of your operating system in order to bring up like a file menu or to close the window or minimize the window or whatever. It's making requests of your operating system. That's another kind of API. So for this class, when we talk about APIs, we're almost talking exclusively about APIs on the internet that are going to use basically web protocols, HTTPS and HTTP, to transmit data. So like when you're trying to get weather or you're trying to get like Spotify playlists or images from the kitten database, you're going to use an API. You're going to make a request uh, through web protocols, HTTP and HTTPS, and you're going to be getting something back, usually JSON. So you can think of it as a door in which an application interacts with another application code or data. Here's some examples, useful APIs, Twitter, Google Maps, Facebook. We talked about some of this, weather, Flickr. Some of these are complicated. Some of them are pretty easy. Google Translate, for instance, is really easy, and I've had students in classes translate text back and forth. Here's some amusing APIs, yes or no, we've already experimented with. The Chuck Norris API, the Star Wars API. You want to find out like, what generation your favorite Pokemon is. You can use the Pokemon API. It's this for that is a kind of a fun API that generates bullshit business speak. I kind of like the taco randomizer because it's giving you random taco recipes that in JSON that you can pull apart and start using. And there's a couple other ones. XKCD is an awesome, awesome geeky comic. So if you want to hang with all the cool kids or programming, you want to read XKCD, and now you have an API interface to it. How do you find more APIs? There is really an assload of them in a bunch of different places. Here are 3 sources for where you can find really big lists of APIs. Super useful, sort of. The problem sometimes is that there are literally a million APIs. Maybe that's an underestimate. And so the trick is finding one that is actually useful, that's still in service, that has good enough documentation that you can understand it. If the API you want to use sounds really awesome, but has crappy documentation, I'm sorry, I'm just going to recommend back away slowly because it will not be helpful to you. Documentation is critical for APIs, and there's no way that you can use an API if the documentation isn't really good. So you'll see. We'll play with some, and you'll get more of a sense of it. So let's talk more about like where APIs come from. Basically, if you have a bunch of data and you want to share it, or you want to create basically doors for applications to take advantage of it. Let's say you're Spotify and you have all this music and you have all this user data and you want that to be available for people so that people can create Spotify apps that use your data. Then you might create an API to share that data. So if you need data and you want to create a program for it, first look to see if an API exists. There's a good chance you might have to register with an application to access their API. To get an API key is what they call it. So they'll give you some really long, like 10 to 15 digit code that you have to include when you make a request to the API. That kind of makes sense if you think about it, because like, what is keeping somebody from just pounding an API and stealing all the data and or just being a general jerk on the web? So the API key allows them to identify who you are, even though you can usually get that for free. And that way, if you're a web jerk, they can cut you off. So third thing is read the API documentation and use it. I would also add to that, find a working example within the documentation, get that to work, don't modify it, just use it exactly as you see it. Hopefully, really good documentation will have it in whatever language you're using, in your case, JavaScript. Get that working, and then slowly modify that to do what you want to do. Again, if you're looking for data, you can visit wherever you're trying to get the data from, Google or Spotify or Facebook or whatever. You can also go to Mashery, Programmable Web, Ask the Googles. All these things will have API information about API data. Now, the API key, generally, when you register, they're going to give you one or two keys, an API key, and sometimes an API secret. You can think of them as like username and password. And then you have to read the docs to see how to use it. There's no single way to use it. There's some common ways that we can use API keys and API secrets, but it's just not a thing that I can say like, this is the way all APIs work. Because if you're Google or your Facebook or your Spotify or your Twitter, you're going to have your own special ways of doing it. And that's kind of a thing, sad aspect. Some of the things you're going to look for are what endpoint URL to use. So those are called endpoints. We've experimented with some. Here's an endpoint. This is the random number endpoint. This is the yes/no endpoint. I think I have some others up here. I don't know. What's this one? A random joke. This is the Chuck Norris endpoint. This is what you should see when you go to the endpoint. You should see a random bit of JSON that tells you, hey, yes, the API that I would like to use is working. Here's the endpoint. Now all I have to do is point my program at it. So then you want to find the documentation, or you need to find out what data you need to pass to the API, to the endpoint. Some of the things that you might have to pass to it are, what format do I want this in? Do I want it in XML? Do I want it in JSON? Do I want it in plain text? Other data that you'll have to pass to it would be your API key or your API secret. And usually there's examples of how that works. And then finally, what's the data you'll get back? So the data you get back will be something like we showed you, right? Some of the like JSON output is data you get back. And you have to know what that looks like, because you're going to have to walk through it once you get it using your encyclopedic JavaScript knowledge. And so here, if you wanted to get the Chuck Norris joke, you're going to have to turn that bit of text into a JavaScript object using JSON parse. And then once you had that object, you'd have to, which this whole thing would be set to, then you'd have to look at, whatever you called it, JSON object dot value dot joke is going to give you the actual joke, right? So you have to kind of walk down through the data to find out, to get the data you need. So we're going to use APIs that return JSON, and if we have a choice, we're going to select JSON if we can. So let's get down to it. We can use jQuery. As I said, we don't want to use pure JavaScript. It's a pain in the arse. We want to use jQuery because it is helpful and fast and easy. Remember that you might screw this up. So if you're doing this locally in an HTML file or in a JavaScript file that's attached to an HTML file, you're going to want your console to be open so you can see what you screwed up when you did it. So here we can use, in this case, jQuery has its own get JSON It has its own get JSON method, and you give it a URL, which will be, a string that points to the endpoint. Whatever data you pass it, usually you'll pass it data in terms as an object. And then finally, we have an anonymous function where we pass the returned data to it, which becomes a local variable of that anonymous function that we can then do stuff to, right? In this case, we are just printing it to the console log. We can run this, we won't. What it would do is it would, if we hit, say, the yes/no API, it would send our JSON object as data to the console. That's pretty cool. We can also use the AJAX method if we need more configuration. Sometimes you might want to, some endpoints, some APIs might require us to give more data, so we might use .ajax. If possible, use something simple like get JSON or load if you can. Let's experiment with some stuff. Let's try this endpoint. I forget what this even is, but we're going to give it a try. See what it is. Okay, this is the Fortune Cookie API. So we're going straight to the API. Some APIs are really clever, and if you're coming from a browser, they will give you documentation, but if you're coming from JavaScript, they will give you JSON. So in this case, what are we supposed to do here, according to my own docs? Read the docs at here. Retrieval function could be from any category. So we're going to get a JSON response. We don't need a specific category, so we can ignore that. So basically, if we hit API/Fortune, that's supposedly our API. So that's our API endpoint. So let's try that. I'm worried that it's HTTP and not HTTPS, but we're going to give it a whirl anyway. There's our endpoint right there. Let's see if there's a secure version. HTTPS:// bam. Oh, screw you guys. That's going to be a challenge for us if we try to get it from a secure site. But in any case, here we can get really awesome Fortune cookies. Thanks, Fortune Cookie API. You should update your website so it's HTTPS. And use get JSON to retrieve data and place it in our web page. Let's try that kind of live-ish. We can do that on the Ucsc webpage because jQuery is installed, and I don't think it's going to care overly much if we use HTTPS. Let's try it. Ucsc.edu. Oh boy, not going to like that. Let's try it. Oh man. I suspect this won't work for the same reason that it didn't work before, because we're trying to do an insecure read, but maybe. Let's give it a try. So get JSON, that's a method through jQuery. Let's go back here to see how we use it. We say URL, and in our case, we want the Fortune Cookie endpoint, not the docs. The string, we have a string. It doesn't need any data, so I guess we'll what? Nothing there. We should probably, this is where we should check the documentation. What's it want? It doesn't care. Let's have an anonymous function. Function that selects, do you remember events way down here? We're going to try to put that. Events is something we know is on the Ucsc webpage, and we're going to replace the, is that going to work? That's not going to work. Let's just report it back to the console log. Okay, and here, when get JSON works, it it passes data, and so there's a good chance this will complain because we're coming from an HTTPS web page. But let's try it. Mixed content. Dun dun dun. That's like your nemesis. That's going to haunt you for the rest of our lives. How about CodePen? CodePen. Is there an insecure version of it? There isn't. Okay. Basically, if there is a web page, if there's an API that doesn't have a secure version, it's kind of old school and not good. So screw it. Let's use instead. Let's use the HTTPS:// Okay, our random joke server, thanks Chuck Norris, actually does allow a secure version. So we're going to change our fortune cookie API, change it to a Chuck Norris joke, and see if it returns. And in fact, it is successful. And let's take a look at what we got back. So type success value. We can look, here's the value itself, category explicit, yada, 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 and here's the joke. So if we wanted to, we can actually set data equal to something and say JSON object. This is just a random variable and is equal to data. And now we can do stuff with it. What now? So, so let's see. You often have to look to see what the output looks like. So we're going to have to go get the value and then joke. So we can say JSON object, quote, value, joke, and that should return the joke. Let's send that to the console log. And you'll notice that that is the same thing as this. For those of you not super comfortable with the way that we access JavaScript objects, this is the same thing, dot value dot joke. It doesn't work if there's spaces in it, but so still wants closing tags. Thank you very much. And let's try it. Chuck Norris, brainwaves are suspected to be harmful to cell phones. It prints it twice because those are the same things. Let's try it again. Bam, Chuck Norris does not play the lottery, doesn't have nearly enough balls. Oh, so clever. Looking back at the Chuck Norris, what it returned, I'll find it again up here somewhere. We could get the joke ID. We could look at the whether it was successful or not. But in any case, we are both getting data from some faraway server. We could even put this, if we wanted to, instead of printing to the console log. Let's delete this guy. Let's insert it into our web page and say, let's see, we want to select it in jQuery. How do we do it? Then $ parenthesis, whoa now, parenthesis, quote, hashtag events, if you remember that. And we're going to change the HTML to this bit, JSON value joke. So we are literally turning the UCSC website into a joke. Let's see if it works. And in fact, we did. If by some incredible space-time paradox, Chuck Norris would ever fight himself, he'd win, period. Okay, so Chuck Norris, API designers are clever, but we are also clever too. That is more or less, you just did it. Now you have almost enough information, probably enough information to actually do homework 7, which relies on APIs. But Mr. Modes, wouldn't it be helpful if you had created some examples for us instead of just leaving us hanging like this? Well, I'm the nice kind of guy that actually does create some examples. So going to my website, bam. Oh, new picture. Week 7. Okay, ready? So we're going to experiment. These are all APIs. History facts for a random year. I can't remember if all these work. Okay, ready? Click down here. Apparently that one doesn't work. Okay. I also created a Your New Boyfriend application. This uses the random person API. Click here. Your new boyfriend is Ryan Sanders, small butterfly 130. Or wait, your new boyfriend is Sylvia Johansson, lazy leopard 714, and Miro Capella, happy ladybug 571. So let's try another one. Random number trivia. This uses the random numbered API. Chances are it won't work now that people.ucsc is HTTPS. This is a good example though. Like what happens if your website does this? How do you know? What have you messed up? How will you ever know what happened? Well, inspect, you already have the answer. I know you're saying it to yourself. Well, you go to the console and what does it say? It says what it always says, mixed content, damn it. Let's try this one. Does your API work with Ajax? Give me an API URL and let's give it a try. So let's try the yes/no API. And we'll give it a try with my example. I use it. There it is. Never find it again, unfortunately. Okay, so here we are. Does this work? The answer is inconclusive. Let's try this fortune cookie website. Okay, answer no, error. So check the console log. So if you have a question about like whether your API works or not, give it a try in my little thing that I created and see if it works. I don't know why the yes/no API didn't work, but let's try another API. How about the Chuck Norris joke one? Click me. Okay. Well, it's not displaying the output, but happily, it's also not erroring either. So let's reload so you can see. It's not erroring. So I guess if it doesn't tell you it's an error, you're probably good. It'd probably be better if my cute little application actually returned your API output, but sorry, man. That's all I got for you. So no doubt you will have questions, but you will do it. You will get through it. I trust you. I have faith. Pause share. New share. Don't want to share. Trying to figure out how to just have my face. I guess we don't get my face. There's my face, bigger. So yeah, good luck. I think you'll do fine. Remember, read the API. So if you have any questions on how to do this, uh, here's your quick API guidelines. Is find your endpoint. Where is it? Sorry, guys. Okay, there it is. Okay, so if you need data, find your API, register if you need to, get an API key or secret or both. Read the API documentation, and then finally go ahead and use it. And if you can, find a working example, try that out, and get it to work. And remember, always check your console log because that's where it's going to report to you if there's any problem. And if you have mixed content, see if you can find a secure version. And if you can't, back away slowly. So anyway, thanks, guys. I will talk to you later. Good luck.